Imagine being a soldier who has been told for years that your enemies are monsters, brutal and heartless creatures who would show no mercy if you fell into their hands. You have heard stories that made your blood run cold, propaganda that painted your captors as demons walking the earth. Then one day, the unthinkable happens. You are captured. Your weapon is taken from your trembling hands. You expect beating, starvation, perhaps even death. But instead, someone offers you a cigarette. Someone asks if you are injured. Someone speaks to you not as a conquered animal, but as a human being. This is the story of thousands of German prisoners of war who experienced something so shocking, so completely opposite to everything they had been taught, that it changed their understanding of the world forever. This is the story of men who went to war believing in absolute evil and absolute good, only to discover that humanity could exist even in the darkest moments of history. This is the story of how kindness became the most powerful weapon of all. The Second World War was a conflict that consumed the entire planet, drawing nations and peoples into a struggle that would claim tens of millions of lives. For German soldiers fighting under the Nazi regime, the war was presented as a battle for survival, a fight against enemies who would destroy their homeland and their people. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to convince these young men that the soldiers they faced, particularly the Americans and British, were ruthless adversaries who would show no quarter. German soldiers were told stories of atrocities, warned that capture meant torture and death, and encouraged to fight to the last bullet rather than surrender. This constant drumbeat of fear and hatred shaped the minds of millions of men who wore the German uniform, filling them with dread about what awaited them if they were ever taken prisoner. When German soldiers first found themselves surrendering to Allied forces, particularly to American and British troops, the moment was filled with terror. Many of these men were young, some barely out of their teenage years, and they had spent months or even years hearing about the terrible fate that awaited prisoners. As they raised their hands in surrender, their hearts pounded with fear. They expected immediate violence, perhaps summary execution. The Nazi propaganda had been so effective that many German soldiers genuinely believed they were about to die. Some shook uncontrollably, while others closed their eyes and whispered final prayers. The moment of surrender represented not just military defeat, but what they believed would be the end of their lives. But then something remarkable happened, something that would shake these men to their very core. Instead of bullets, they received orders to line up. Instead of beatings, they were searched for weapons but not harmed. Instead of screams and violence, they heard instructions given in calm, professional tones. American and British soldiers treated the act of taking prisoners as a military procedure, not as an opportunity for revenge. The German prisoners found themselves being processed, counted, and organized with an efficiency that was almost shocking in its ordinariness. There was no gleeful cruelty, no savage satisfaction in their captors' eyes. The Allied soldiers simply did their jobs, treating the surrender as one more task in the long list of wartime duties. The real shock came in the smaller moments, the tiny acts of humanity that German prisoners had never expected to experience. A British soldier offering a canteen of water to a thirsty German who had been marching for days. An American medic kneeling beside a wounded German soldier, working to stop the bleeding with the same care he would show to one of his own men. Guards who spoke a few words of German telling prisoners that they would be safe now, that the fighting was over for them. These small gestures carried enormous weight because they contradicted everything the German soldiers had been taught to expect. Each kind word, each moment of basic human decency, chipped away at years of propaganda and revealed a truth that was almost too surprising to believe. Many German prisoners found themselves struggling to understand what was happening. Some thought it must be a trick, a cruel game before the real punishment began. They waited for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to be revealed as mockery. But as hours turned into days, the treatment remained consistent. Prisoners were given food, not gourmet meals but rations that kept them fed. They were given places to sleep, even if those places were tents or temporary barracks. They were allowed to receive medical care for their wounds and illnesses. The Geneva Convention, which outlined the proper treatment of prisoners of war, was not just a piece of paper to the Allied forces. It was a set of rules they actually followed, even when dealing with soldiers who had fought for a regime that had committed unspeakable atrocities. The transportation of German prisoners to more permanent prison camps provided another series of shocking revelations. As prisoners were loaded onto trucks or trains, they expected terrible conditions, packed like animals with no regard for their comfort or safety. While the journey was certainly not luxurious, it was far better than what they had anticipated. Prisoners were given space to sit, were provided with water during the journey, and were not subjected to deliberate cruelty. Guards maintained order and discipline, but they did so without unnecessary violence. For men who had been taught that their enemies were barbaric monsters, this professional and relatively humane treatment was deeply confusing. During these journeys, some prisoners began to talk among themselves, sharing their shock and confusion. They compared notes about their treatment, trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. Some remained convinced it was all a deception, that the real horrors would begin once they reached the camps. Others began to wonder if perhaps the propaganda they had been fed was not entirely accurate. A few dared to consider that maybe, just maybe, the people they had been fighting were not so different from themselves. These conversations were whispered at first, because questioning what they had been taught felt almost like treason, even in captivity. For the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who were transported to camps in the United States, the shock of their treatment reached levels that seemed almost absurd. These men had been fighting in the rubble of European cities, had experienced the deprivation and destruction of total war, and had been warned that America was a land of gangsters and savages. Instead, they found themselves in camps located in places so peaceful and prosperous that they seemed like another world entirely. The camps were often situated in rural areas where the abundance of food and resources was visible everywhere. Prisoners could see farms with healthy livestock, fields full of crops, and a countryside that showed no signs of the war that was still raging across the ocean. The camps themselves were basic but adequate, with barracks that provided shelter from the elements, sanitary facilities that worked, and mess halls where regular meals were served. German prisoners were astonished by the quantity and quality of the food they received. Men who had been subsisting on meager rations in the German military found themselves eating better as prisoners than they had as soldiers. They received meat, bread, vegetables, and even occasional treats. The American military followed the Geneva Convention requirement that prisoners receive rations equivalent to what American soldiers ate, and the sheer abundance of American food production meant that this standard was relatively easy to meet. Prisoners who had been hungry for years found themselves gaining weight in captivity, a fact that seemed to mock everything they had been told about their enemies. One of the most surprising aspects of life as a German POW in Allied hands was the work program that many prisoners participated in. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to be employed in certain types of work, as long as it was not directly related to the war effort. In the United States, with so many American men serving overseas, there was a severe labor shortage, particularly in agriculture. German prisoners found themselves being sent out to work on farms, in forests, and in food processing facilities. They picked cotton in the South, harvested wheat in the Midwest, and cut timber in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. They worked alongside American civilians, and many developed relationships with the farmers and business owners who employed them. What shocked the prisoners even more was that they were paid for their work. The wages were minimal, paid in scrip that could only be used in the camp canteen, but the very concept of being paid seemed incredible to men who had expected to be worked to death. With their earnings, prisoners could buy small luxuries like cigarettes, candy, and toiletries. Some camps even had canteens that sold beer, allowing prisoners to enjoy a drink after a day of work. The idea of enemy prisoners being allowed to purchase beer seemed so absurd that some prisoners thought it must be a dream. They had been told they would face starvation and torture, and instead they were earning money and buying snacks. As German prisoners worked alongside American civilians, they had opportunities to observe American society up close, and what they saw challenged many of their assumptions. The Nazi propaganda had painted America as a nation in decline, torn apart by racial conflict and economic inequality, dominated by Jewish conspiracies and gangster violence. While America certainly had its problems, including the very real horror of racial segregation in the South, the prisoners saw a nation that was prosperous, confident, and united in its war effort. They saw farmers who owned their own land and modern equipment. They saw small towns with churches, schools, and businesses. They saw ordinary Americans who seemed content with their lives and committed to winning the war. Some prisoners had conversations with the Americans they worked for, and these interactions were often eye-opening for both sides. American farmers and their families were curious about these German soldiers, wondering what had made them fight for Hitler. German prisoners, in turn, asked questions about America, trying to understand how the country they had been taught to despise actually functioned. These conversations were sometimes awkward, limited by language barriers and the strange circumstances, but they were moments of genuine human connection across the divide of war. A few prisoners even formed friendships with Americans, relationships that would continue through letters after the war ended. German prisoners held in Britain and Canada faced different circumstances, but often similar surprises regarding their treatment. In Britain, prisoners arrived in a nation that had been bombed and besieged, that had fought alone against Nazi Germany for a year, and that had every reason to hate German soldiers. Yet even here, the British adhered to the Geneva Convention and treated prisoners with basic humanity. British camps were more austere than American ones, reflecting Britain's own wartime shortages, but they were not deliberately cruel. Prisoners received adequate food by British wartime standards, which meant they sometimes ate better than British civilians who were still subject to rationing. Canadian camps offered experiences somewhere between the British and American situations. Canada had vast spaces and more resources than Britain, so camps there were often comfortable by wartime standards. German prisoners worked in Canadian forests, on Canadian farms, and in Canadian industries, experiencing a country that many had never even thought about before the war. The Canadians, like the Americans, generally treated prisoners correctly, following the rules and maintaining professional standards. Some German prisoners who worked in remote areas of Canada developed an appreciation for the country's natural beauty and the straightforward character of the people they encountered. The humane treatment that German prisoners received in Western Allied hands became even more striking when compared to what happened to Germans captured on the Eastern Front. The war between Germany and the Soviet Union was fought with a brutality that exceeded even the terrible standards of the rest of World War II. Hitler had ordered that the war in the East be fought as a war of annihilation, and the Nazi regime treated Soviet prisoners with horrific cruelty, deliberately starving millions to death. The Soviet Union, in turn, treated German prisoners with corresponding harshness. Of the nearly 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, approximately one-third died in captivity from starvation, disease, overwork, and exposure to brutal conditions. German soldiers were acutely aware of this difference, and many who surrendered to Western forces did so deliberately, choosing to give up to the Americans or British rather than face capture by the Soviets. The contrast in treatment was so stark that it seemed to validate the Nazi propaganda about the Soviets being subhuman enemies, but it also created a cognitive dissonance when it came to understanding the Western Allies. If the Americans and British were supposed to be part of the same evil conspiracy against Germany, why did they treat prisoners so differently from the Soviets? This question troubled many German prisoners, forcing them to reconsider what they had been taught about their enemies and about the war itself. The Allied powers, particularly the Americans, saw the prison camps as an opportunity not just to hold enemy soldiers, but to begin the process of denazification. Camp authorities organized educational programs designed to expose prisoners to democratic ideas and to counter the Nazi ideology that had shaped their thinking. Prisoners were shown films about Nazi atrocities, including footage of concentration camps, which many German soldiers had known nothing about. They were given access to newspapers and magazines that told different versions of the war than the propaganda they had received. They could attend lectures and classes on various subjects, from American history to practical skills like English language instruction. The reaction of prisoners to these re-education efforts varied widely. Some men were receptive, eager to learn and willing to question what they had been taught. These prisoners engaged seriously with the educational programs, read the materials provided, and began to develop new perspectives on the war and on Germany's role in it. Others were resistant, dismissing the programs as enemy propaganda no different from what they had received from their own government. They refused to believe the evidence of Nazi crimes, convinced it was all fabricated. Many prisoners fell somewhere in between, uncertain what to believe but slowly beginning to question their previous certainties. The kindness of their treatment made the educational message more effective, because it was harder to dismiss the arguments of people who were treating you decently than to reject the claims of cruel captors. One of the most surprising aspects of POW life in Western camps was the opportunity for recreational activities. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be allowed some leisure time and the chance to engage in activities beyond work and basic survival. Allied camp authorities took this requirement seriously, and German prisoners found themselves with access to sports equipment, musical instruments, and art supplies. Camps organized soccer leagues, and the games became major events with prisoners forming teams representing different regions of Germany. The competition was fierce but friendly, giving men something to care about beyond the monotony of camp life. Many prisoners discovered or redeveloped artistic talents during their captivity. Camps had orchestras and bands, theater groups that performed plays, and art classes where men could learn to paint or draw. Some prisoners created remarkably sophisticated cultural programs, performing classical music concerts or staging elaborate theatrical productions. The American and British guards sometimes attended these performances, creating strange moments where enemies sat together enjoying Bach or Shakespeare. For prisoners who had expected brutality and deprivation, the opportunity to play music or paint landscapes seemed almost miraculous. These activities helped maintain morale and mental health, but they also reinforced the message that their captors saw them as human beings deserving of dignity. The ability to correspond with family back in Germany was another privilege that shocked many prisoners. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners the right to send and receive mail, and the Allied powers maintained postal systems that allowed these communications to continue throughout the war. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, passing through military censors on both sides who checked for security violations, but they did arrive. German prisoners could write to their wives, parents, and children, letting them know they were alive and reasonably well. They could receive letters and packages from home, maintaining a connection to the families and communities they had left behind. For many prisoners, this ability to communicate with loved ones was emotionally overwhelming. They had believed they would never see their families again, that surrender meant disappearance into a void. Instead, they could tell their families where they were, describe their conditions in general terms, and receive news from home. The letters that arrived brought both comfort and pain, as prisoners learned about the hardships their families endured under Allied bombing and the chaos of the war's final stages. Some prisoners received terrible news, learning of family members killed in air raids or during the Soviet advance into Germany. The ability to grieve while in captivity, to share sorrows across the distance, was a strange comfort that no one had expected. As the war drew to a close and Allied forces liberated Nazi concentration camps, the full horror of the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities became undeniable. Film crews documented what they found at camps like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Buchenwald, and some of this footage was shown to German prisoners of war. The screenings were intended to ensure that Germans could never deny what had been done in their name, to force confrontation with the evil that the Nazi regime had perpetrated. For many prisoners, watching this footage was a devastating experience that shattered whatever loyalty to the Nazi cause they still maintained. Some prisoners refused to believe what they were seeing, insisting the footage must be faked, propaganda created to justify the war against Germany. They could not or would not accept that the regime they had fought for could commit such horrors. But many others found the evidence impossible to deny. They sat in stunned silence as the film showed piles of emaciated corpses, walking skeletons who had somehow survived, and the industrial infrastructure of genocide. The contrast between how they were being treated as prisoners and how the Nazi regime had treated its victims could not have been more stark. The Americans and British were feeding them, housing them, treating their wounds, and showing them basic human decency. The regime they had served had murdered millions of helpless people with calculated cruelty. This realization was crushing for men who had believed they were fighting for something good and honorable. The combination of humane treatment and confrontation with Nazi crimes created a powerful psychological transformation in many German prisoners. Men who had arrived in the camps as convinced Nazis or loyal soldiers gradually became critics of the regime they had served. The process was not universal and not always quick, but it was real. Prisoners began to discuss among themselves what Germany had done and what it meant. They debated whether they bore responsibility for crimes they had not personally committed but had occurred in the name of their nation. They wondered what kind of country Germany would become after the war and what role they might play in building something new. Some prisoners underwent dramatic conversions, becoming ardent advocates for democracy and opponents of everything the Nazi regime had represented. These men threw themselves into the re-education programs, learned everything they could about democratic governance, and prepared themselves to return to Germany as agents of change. Others remained more cautious, uncertain what they believed but clear that they wanted no part of Nazism or militarism in the future. A minority remained unrepentant, bitter about Germany's defeat and unconvinced by what they had been shown, but even these men were affected by the experience of humane captivity. It was hard to maintain absolute hatred for enemies who treated you with basic decency. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, German prisoners faced a new uncertainty about their future. The fighting was over, but they could not simply go home. Germany lay in ruins, divided into occupation zones controlled by the four Allied powers. Millions of people were displaced, cities were destroyed, and the basic infrastructure of society had collapsed. The Allied powers had to decide what to do with the millions of German prisoners in their custody. Some prisoners were repatriated quickly, but many others remained in camps for months or even years after the war ended. The continued captivity after the war's end was frustrating for prisoners who wanted to return home and help rebuild their country. Some became bitter, feeling that the Geneva Convention no longer applied and that their detention was unjustified. But even during this extended captivity, the standards of treatment generally remained consistent. Prisoners continued to work, to receive adequate food and shelter, and to be treated as human beings rather than as defeated enemies to be punished. The American and British governments faced pressure to maintain large numbers of prisoners, because the reconstruction of Europe required labor, and because there were concerns about releasing millions of trained soldiers into a chaotic situation. When German prisoners finally returned home, they carried with them memories and experiences that set them apart from Germans who had remained in the homeland. They had seen other countries, encountered different ways of life, and been treated with unexpected humanity by people they had been taught to hate. Many former prisoners became advocates for reconciliation and democracy in post-war Germany. They had learned that the propaganda they had been fed was false, that the enemies they had been told to fear were capable of great kindness, and that a different kind of future was possible for their country. The stories that returning prisoners told had a significant impact on German society's understanding of the war and its aftermath. While some Germans remained in denial about Nazi crimes and bitter about their defeat, the testimony of former POWs who had been treated well helped complicate the narrative. These men could speak from personal experience about American and British fairness, about the opportunities they had been given, and about the contrast between Allied treatment and the horror of what the Nazis had done. Their voices added to the chorus pushing Germany toward democracy and integration with the West, rather than continued hostility and isolation. The humane treatment of German prisoners did not happen by accident. It resulted from deliberate policy decisions made at the highest levels of Allied governments, and from the daily choices of thousands of guards, administrators, and military personnel who implemented those policies. Leaders like General Dwight Eisenhower and British officials understood that how they treated prisoners would reflect on their nations and on the cause they fought for. They insisted on compliance with the Geneva Convention not just as a legal requirement, but as a moral imperative. They recognized that mistreating prisoners would make them no better than the enemy they fought and would undermine the very values they claimed to defend. Equally important were the ordinary soldiers and civilians who served as guards and administrators in the camps. These were men who had every reason to hate Germans. Many had lost friends in combat, had seen the destruction caused by German military aggression, and had every justification for cruelty. Yet most of them chose to do their jobs professionally, treating prisoners with the basic respect that human beings deserve. They did not become friends with the prisoners, but they did not abuse them either. They followed the rules even when it would have been easier to look the other way. These quiet acts of adherence to principle by thousands of individuals made the system work. The story of German POW treatment in Western Allied hands was generally positive, but it was not perfect or universal. There were instances of mistreatment, moments when guards or officials failed to live up to the standards they were supposed to maintain. Some prisoners were beaten, some were denied adequate care, and some faced discrimination or cruelty from individuals who could not or would not set aside their hatred. African American soldiers sometimes treated German prisoners better than they themselves were treated by the segregated American society they served, creating painful ironies that some German prisoners noticed and struggled to understand. There were also significant differences in how prisoners were treated based on when and where they were captured. Prisoners taken in the final chaotic weeks of the war sometimes experienced harsher conditions simply because the system was overwhelmed. The immediate aftermath of combat could be dangerous for prisoners, as emotions ran high and battlefield rage had not yet cooled. Prisoners who were suspected of being SS members or war criminals faced much tougher interrogations and stricter confinement than ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. The system of humane treatment had limits and exceptions, and not every German prisoner experienced the kindness that shocked so many. The good treatment of German prisoners also served important propaganda and political purposes for the Allies. By adhering to the Geneva Convention and treating prisoners well, the Western Allies demonstrated their commitment to the rule of law and human rights. This treatment contrasted sharply with Nazi Germany's conduct and helped justify the Allied cause as a fight for civilization against barbarism. It also served practical purposes, encouraging German soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. As word spread that prisoners were treated well, more German soldiers became willing to give up, potentially saving lives on both sides. Looking forward to the post-war period, American and British leaders understood that they would need German cooperation to rebuild Europe and to face the emerging challenge of the Soviet Union. Brutalizing German prisoners would create lasting enmity and make that cooperation much harder to achieve. By treating prisoners with humanity, the Western Allies laid groundwork for eventual reconciliation and alliance. The men who returned from captivity with positive experiences became natural supporters of Western-oriented policies in post-war Germany. The investment in humane treatment paid political dividends that extended far beyond the war years. Among the thousands of German prisoners who experienced this unexpected humanity were individual stories of remarkable transformation. There were former Nazi Party members who renounced their ideology after months of respectful treatment and education. There were soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front and committed atrocities, who gradually confronted what they had done and sought some kind of redemption. There were teenagers who had been drafted in the war's final stages and who grew into adulthood behind the wire, shaped by American or British ideas rather than Nazi propaganda. Some prisoners formed lasting friendships with their captors or with the American families they worked for. There are documented cases of German POWs who returned to the United States after the war, marrying American women they had met during their captivity or settling in communities where they had worked as prisoners. Others maintained correspondence with American or British friends for decades, building bridges across the divide of war. These personal connections, multiplied across thousands of individuals, helped create the foundation for the post-war alliance between Western Germany and the Western democracies. The experience of German prisoners of war in Western Allied hands became part of the larger story of World War II and its aftermath. In Germany, the memory of this treatment contributed to a general sense that while the war had been a catastrophe and German crimes had been horrific, the Western Allies had conducted themselves with honor. This memory helped make the idea of partnership with America and Britain more acceptable to Germans who might otherwise have remained hostile. It supported the narrative that Germany could learn from the Western democracies and build a better future as part of the Western community of nations. In America and Britain, the story of how German prisoners were treated became a point of pride, evidence that even in total war the democracies had maintained their values. The story served as a contrast to totalitarian methods and as proof that liberal societies could be strong without being cruel. It became part of the self-image of these nations as places that respected human dignity even in their enemies. The memory was sometimes simplified or romanticized, glossing over exceptions and complications, but the core truth remained that the Western Allies had generally treated German prisoners far better than they had any obligation to do. The story of German prisoners being shocked by humane treatment carries lessons that extend far beyond World War II. It demonstrates the power of propaganda to shape perceptions and the equal power of reality to shatter false beliefs. It shows that even in the midst of terrible conflict, it is possible to maintain ethical standards and treat enemies with basic human dignity. It proves that kindness can be more powerful than cruelty in changing hearts and minds. The German soldiers who expected brutality and received humanity learned lessons that no amount of propaganda could have taught them. The story also illustrates how the choices we make about how to treat defeated enemies can shape the future in profound ways. The decision to treat German prisoners well, to follow international law even when it was not convenient, helped create the conditions for post-war reconciliation and for Germany's integration into the democratic West. Had the Western Allies chosen the path of revenge and cruelty, the post-war period would have been far more difficult and the Cold War alliance structure might never have formed. Small acts of decency by thousands of individuals, backed by policy commitments from leaders, had consequences that echoed through decades. As years passed and the veterans of World War II aged, many former German prisoners spoke publicly about their experiences. They appeared in documentaries, wrote memoirs, and participated in reconciliation events. They told stories of the moment they surrendered expecting death and instead received water. They described the shock of being fed adequately, of being allowed to work and earn money, of being treated as human beings by people who had every reason to hate them. They spoke with emotion about how these experiences changed their understanding of the world and of themselves. These testimonies served as powerful reminders of humanity's capacity for both great evil and great goodness. The same war that saw the Holocaust and the deliberate murder of millions also saw Allied soldiers sharing cigarettes with captured enemies and guards, ensuring that prisoners received adequate food and medical care. The contrast was almost incomprehensible, yet it was real. The German prisoners who experienced this contrast had to wrestle with it for the rest of their lives, trying to understand how the same species could be capable of such extremes. The story of German prisoners of war being shocked by the humane treatment they received from Allied captors is ultimately a story about the power of choosing humanity over hatred. In the midst of the most destructive war in human history, fought against a regime that represented absolute evil, the Western democracies made a choice to adhere to international law and basic human decency. They did so not because it was easy or because German soldiers deserved kindness, but because they understood that how you treat your enemies defines who you are. The Americans and British who guarded German prisoners, who fed them and provided medical care and allowed them to maintain their dignity, were not naive or soft. They were strong enough to be merciful, confident enough in their cause to be just. For the German soldiers who experienced this treatment, the shock was profound and lasting. They had been prepared for hell and instead found humanity. That discovery changed them in ways large and small, immediate and gradual. It forced them to question everything they had been taught, to confront the lies they had believed, and to recognize that their supposed enemies were not monsters, but people with their own moral codes and values. Some prisoners were transformed completely, becoming advocates for democracy and reconciliation. Others changed more subtly, carrying quiet doubts about what they had been told and what Germany had done. Even those who resisted the lessons of their captivity could not completely escape the impact of being treated with unexpected kindness. The legacy of this chapter of World War II extends far beyond the individuals directly involved. It demonstrated that international humanitarian law could work, that the Geneva Convention was not just a paper agreement but a framework that saved lives and preserved dignity. It showed that victory did not require brutality, that military strength could coexist with moral principle. The treatment of German prisoners became a foundation for post-war reconciliation, helping transform yesterday's enemies into today's allies. The men who returned from captivity with stories of fair treatment helped their nation understand that cooperation with the West was possible and desirable. In our own time, when conflicts still rage and questions of how to treat captured enemies remain urgent, the story offers guidance. It reminds us that the hardest choices are often the most important, that maintaining our values under pressure is what proves their worth. It shows that propaganda and dehumanization can be overcome by simple acts of decency, that seeing the human being behind the enemy uniform can change everything. The German prisoners who were shocked by kindness learned a lesson that all of us need to remember, that even in the darkest times, humanity can prevail if we have the courage to choose it. Their story is not just history but a testament to the better angels of our nature, a reminder that we are capable of treating even our enemies with dignity, and in doing so, we elevate ourselves. The shock those prisoners felt was the shock of discovering that the world was more complex than propaganda suggested, that goodness could exist where they had been promised only evil, and that perhaps, just perhaps, there was hope for humanity after all.